Now this project, The Eyes of the State, in some part, it stems just from the title. I kind of like the title. I thought, well, I'm going to build a project around this title. It's a project I've been working on for a couple of years now, but because of various other things, I've sort of had to put it on a back burner, and I haven't been able to give it the attention it really deserves. But that being said, I've got some good research, I think, already, and I'm hoping to sort of continue the research into the future. But for now, it is sort of an open-ended project, and some of this stuff is somewhat speculative, so I'm interested and curious about people's thoughts on it. So I want to begin with a little story. So in November 2015, after weeks of bitter political rhetoric and much discussion about the consequences of proposed changes, the UK Tory government reversed their decision to eliminate tax credits for the poorest. Now, while much was made of this reversal, particularly about who deserved responsibility for the change, whether it had been labor pressure, some sort of Tory conscience, I think there was some subtle politics going on behind the scenes. And this has to do with the £27 billion mystery. Now, the primary justification that was given for the reversal by George Osborne was that he had suddenly come into a windfall of money and therefore could ease up on austerity, didn't have to make these massive cuts. Now, if you take a deeper look into this justification, what you find out is that a good chunk of that extra revenue, that windfall, came from modeling changes by the Office for Budget Responsibility. And you can see here this graph is basically charting out the accumulation of extra money that is going to be coming into the government as a result of modeling changes. These are not changes in the state of the economy, they are changes in the model themselves. So this, I think, is a fascinating sort of case study where you see how powerful and how important modeling is to economic policymaking today. Now suddenly, the discourse of sparring over tax revenues found a sort of material embodiment in the computers of the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now I think this raises a number of different questions, and this is sort of the stuff I want to discuss in the larger project. I'm not going to be able to answer all these questions today, but I would like to touch upon them. So what are these models? What is actually going on here behind the scenes? How can they change the possibilities of government action so much? How can they add billions of pounds out of seemingly thin air? And what effect do they have on politicians? Are they a sort of post hoc justification for action that was already going to be taken? Or do they literally change the sort of scope of political possibilities? So these are the sort of questions I want to try to answer in this research project. Again, I won't do all of it today, but I'm going to touch upon some of it. So what I want to do in the talk is to focus on the history of economic modeling, sort of different approaches to how the economy has been thought of, some of the limits of today's models, and then also propose some speculative possibilities for what might be a sort of people's modeling, or a more sort of post-capitalist version of modeling. Now, throughout all of this, I think it's one thing to remember is that the economy is not a natural object. It's something which has had to be socially and technically created over the course of centuries. And my argument, my sort of hunch throughout all of this is that the construction of the economy as an object of thought, as a conceptual object, goes hand in hand with the construction of levers of power over the economy, and that the ways in which we think about the economy change how we can interact with the economy. So I think modeling is therefore a crucial medium, bridging conceptual understanding and pragmatic manipulation. So I'll begin with sort of the very earliest attempts to theorize and sort of visualize the economy as a totality. It's a very famous sort of chart here from Francois Quesnay in 1758. And this is probably the first attempt to sort of think of the economy as a sort of totality, as a unit. Before this point, the economy had more of a sense of economizing. You try to make a sort of resourceful use of material, but the economy as a sort of separate, independent object wasn't really conceived of in that sort of way. So this is the first attempt to sort of visualize it. And effectively what he's trying to do here is map out the series of exchanges between different actors within the economy. Peasants, lords, farmers, all of these sorts of things. So this is the very first attempt, I would say. An often sort of forgotten attempt is Marx as well. So Marx in the 1850s, 1860s I think most notably in the schemas of expanded reproduction, really tries to visualize the economy as a totality again. So again, this is quite a sophisticated approach to thinking about how the economy might be visualized, how we can start to think about it as an object. Now he's remaining, I would argue, at a more heuristic level than necessarily a predictive level when he's doing this sort of visualizing. And I think he's also tending to illustrate theoretical issues rather than doing an explanation of actually existing economies. He's not trying to build up national income or anything like that. Now another sort of forgotten period is German historical economists in the 1880s. And they were really focused on transport and communications infrastructure. They focused a lot on trade data, which is one of the easiest things you could sort of find, and production data as well. And they made use of a lot of cartographic images of the economy, trying to geographically represent what the economy might actually look like. Now, I think what's sort of interesting about this map is that there's one thing missing from it, and it's national borders. And I think one thing that's quite common amongst all the early representations of the economy is that they're seen as global. So on the one hand, you get a sort of liberal conception of the economy where it's just a space of exchange. And it doesn't matter if that exchange crosses borders, it's all exchange. It expands to the entire world in principle. Now likewise with the Marxist image. For Marx, it's the capitalist mode of production, and this is a massive social totality which reaches out into colonies, reaches into every aspect of society. It's an all-encompassing sort of vision of what the economy is. And it doesn't have to be bound by any sort of territorial limits, particularly national limits. So all of it tends to be a very global perspective on the economy, which is very different, as we're going to see, it's very different from how we think of the economy today as a nationally bounded unit. And the economy is also seen primarily here through visual media, rather than being, say, a literary media, which is what it had been done before, or a numerical media, or a computational media as what we have today. It was primarily sort of visual diagrams and images of what the economy actually is. Now eventually we get the shift to national economies. So the sort of global image of the economy gets shifted down to a national sort of focus. And I think there's a number of different reasons why. First of all, there's just a creation of new national data points. So the sort of rise of the welfare state and the rise of bureaucracy and all of this sort of stuff gives impetus to create and collect more and more data on a national based level. So you start to have the data to give a sense to what the national economy might mean. Now likewise, in the same point in the early 1900s, you have the collapse of empires and the collapse of the first era of globalization. So the national territory starts to take on more and more precedence. National imperatives to be beating out, Germany in industrial production or America in industrial production, things like this. So it starts to be sort of political imperatives and sort of the basic data collection means to start thinking about national economies rather than global economies. So a couple quick examples. This is what's called social tables, and it was an early way to sort of measure national inequality. And this is, Thomas Piketty, for instance, in his work has gone back and looked at all these sorts of things as a way to sort of track inequality over the course of the past couple of centuries. And this is a sort of early representation, an early sort of indicator of the national economy. Now you also have Neumann and Spallert, who created the first set of international economic statistics in 1878. And again, this is sort of an emerging turn towards more numerical ways of thinking about the economy as opposed to a visual way. So it starts to be a collection of data and numbers and statistical tables rather than being schemas and diagrams. Now the traditional sort of story about why the image of the national economy came about has to do with econometrics in the early 1900s, but also sort of foundationally within Keynes's work. So econometrics began to look at the economy as a sort of series of interacting set of different elements. And all these sorts of interacting relationships became the focus of their work, trying to map them out and trying to draw upon what the system might be behind the different data. Now Keynes famously, in his book, General Theory here, went on to basically found the idea of macroeconomics, and the national economy became the standard sort of unit and way of thinking about economics. But I think actually there's a sort of hidden story as well, which is the Soviet effort. The Soviets in the late 19-teens and 1920s faced up with the problems of a war economy and how to run a communist economy. To do that sort of planning required national level images of the economy. And so what you see actually in the 1920s in the Soviet Union is an immensely productive and experimental period of trying to think about what the economy might look like. So this is one example here of input-output tables, trying to match up the production of agriculture, for instance, and then how much of agriculture has to go to every other industry. How many of these goods in steel act as intermediate inputs to other industries? So this was a real attempt to give an image to the national economy. I think if we actually want to trace out the origins of the national economy, this is a good place to look at. Now, one of my favorite examples, just sort of pure curiosity, this is called ammoniac. And this is a sort of early attempt to provide a physical model of the economy. So rather than doing it through data, rather than doing it through visual means, what this thing effectively does is models the economy using water and fluid dynamics. So water acts as money in the economy, and it flows through this entire system. You can change it on the basis of investment rates, tax rates, all of these sorts of things. And you start to see how the economy operates through physical principles, with money being equal to water and this sort of thing. So I think it's just a fascinating example of sort of early attempts to think about what the economy actually looks like. Okay, now Timothy Mitchell has some good work on this as well, looking at sort of what are the consequences of thinking about the economy in national terms rather than, say, global terms or regional terms or any other terms. And he points out there's three major consequences. One of these is it just gives a new prominence to the nation state. So the nation state becomes the fundamental sort of focus of economic policy. You have a new geopolitical imaginary, less so empires, more and more nation states. And you have a new focus on intensive growth. So rather than economic growth being a matter of expanding out territories, gathering new resources around the rest of the world, you're more and more concerned about GDP and building up the productivity of your national economy. So as our images of the economy change, so do our economic policies and the way that we think about economic growth. Okay, so I want to move on now to the sort of early stages of what might be the computational turn within economic policymaking. So I'm going to go sort of briefly through some of this, but we can maybe discuss a bit of it more later. So broadly speaking, in the 1960s and 1970s, if you look across a number of different sciences, there is a computational turn. I think climate science is one of the biggest examples here. Basically, computers become cheap enough and effective enough to start using in a whole variety of different ways. Climate science makes massive use of them starting in the 1950s and 60s, and economics starts using them as well during this time period. Now, these early models were based upon Keynesian principles, so ISLM models is what they are called. And they were explicitly designed to provide a sort of conceptual platform for the government to stabilize the economy. So after the war, the problem becomes, well, how do we maintain a stable economy, providing enough jobs for people, enough wages for people, in order to keep the economy kicking over? These models were designed explicitly as a way to manipulate the economy and guide the economy. And in line with sort of dominant theoretical and political perspectives of the time, these models focused heavily upon fiscal policy levers. So the approach was to use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, fix it up. Monetary policy played only a very small role. Effectively, they would change short-term interest rates, and that was about it. There wasn't any massive use of monetary policy at the time. Now, the problem with these models is that in the 1970s, you get stagflation. And according to these models, stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation, should be impossible to have at the same time. Now, the data proved that wrong. It was actually possible to have these two things at the same time. But obviously, that causes problems for these models when you're trying to think about, well, what's going on and what can be done? And there's some interesting research in this shift in macroeconomic models in the 1970s and 80s in the UK, where you start to see actually that one of the reasons why they started to shift towards more monetarist models was because policymakers saw those models providing new levers over the economy. And so if policymakers, politicians want to be able to guide the economy and run it in a proper way, they're constantly looking for new ways to sort of manipulate the economy. So political demands also sort of lead to further developments in models as well. Is one of the things that's going on here. Now, in terms of a sort of academic critique, the problem that was sort of thought to be with these models here was basically that the sort of individual agents in the models were lacking any sort of forward-looking expectations. So the idea being that if you're an agent in the world, you're a business, and you have expectations about monetary policy and fiscal policy, you're going to change your behavior as a result of that. Now, that wasn't put into the models. And this meant that it led to all sorts of different problems. And so what happened was academics started to develop models which included forward-looking expectations on the part of agents. And this was the idea about how you start to overcome the problems of these models. Now, this leads to the 1980s. You start to get what's called freshwater models. And this is a sort of, when we think about free market models and neoliberal models, this is sort of what we have in mind. And these are models that purported to show that the government, basically, any sort of government intervention would have a negative effect on the economy. A negative effect at worst, or at best, it would have a sort of neutral effect. For instance, the benefits of fiscal stimulus would get wiped away by higher taxes later on, and this would cause all sorts of problems. Now, what's sort of interesting about this is that instead of constructing a new way to manipulate the economy, this basically takes the levers away from government. These sort of models are saying that government does have levers, but it shouldn't use them in any way. The government is actually a hindrance to the free market and should just leave the economy to be as it wants to be. Now, the impotence of government stabilization policies was derived from these models. Now, the interesting part, though, is that these models were simplified in numerous ways, and these simplifications led to the conclusion that government was useless in terms of any sort of economic intervention. And there's sort of political choices going on here about how to simplify these models, how to make them computationally tractable in a way that then gets played into the politics of it. So there's one, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the president of it, he mentions when he's discussing these models that the fact that these certain simplifications were made and that they led to certain political outcomes, in his words, was almost coincidental. And I think that there was a lot of sort of political aspects going on in the construction of these models to say that government should have no interventionary power. Now, more recently, we get DSGE models. Now, they started to get developed in the academic world in the 1980s, and they become massively popular in central banks in the 2000s. Now, they're unique for being highly theory-based. So these are basically models that try to live up to all the critiques of the ISLM models and try to build up a sort of purely theoretical image of the economy in a way that doesn't have to take into account any empirical data. And when you try to match these sort of models up to economic data, this runs into all sorts of problems. But economists sort of like them because it is theoretically satisfying, it's well-grounded in micro-foundations, and it's also a nice basis to build an academic career off of these sorts of things. So these models have become extremely popular recently, in the past, say, 15, 20 years. Now, the basic idea of them is that they have little agents running around in these models called representative agents. There's one for firms, there's one for households, there's one for governments. Households are presumed to maximize welfare, firms are presumed to maximize profits, and governments are typically modeled as unproductive, which you can already see the sort of political implications of that as well. If it's one of your assumptions that the government's unproductive, you can see the conclusion is going to be, yeah, it's useless. Now, they're dynamic because they include the expectations of the future. So the agents within it have expectations about what the government is going to do. They respond to those expectations. They're stochastic in that they allow random external shocks to disrupt the system. So things like a change in consumer demand, the behavior of financial markets, this sort of stuff. They're considered general because they apply to all the markets in an economy. And they are equilibrium because supply and demand are supposed to be matched together via a single set of prices. The whole system is supposed to reach equilibrium inevitably. Now I should mention here that the core models used by central banks, the very biggest models that they use, are not DSGE models. So the US and the UK use what's called large-scale macroeconometric models. And I'll give you just one example. The Federal Reserve's model is called FRB/World. Has about 250 equations. 40 of those equations describe the US economy. The rest of them describe the rest of the world, which is divided up into 11 different regions. There's a sort of interesting attempt here to sort of move away from the national economy and start thinking about the global economy again. But how do you model that sort of thing is one of the sort of ongoing issues. So the core models that central banks use are these large-scale models. But that being said, DSGE models have become the workhorse of central banks. They're used all the time. They're referenced all the time. They're used in policy discussions all the time. So the sort of large-scale models are used for other purposes. Now, there's a number of problems with DSGE modeling. And we saw a lot of this in the crisis. So there's no involuntary unemployment in a DSGE model. Unemployment for them is just a freely chosen sort of thing. If wages are high, you can expect more workers to come in. If wages are low, then people will stay out of the labor market. It's an absurd sort of assumption, and obviously doesn't really make sense of what's happened after the crisis, the continued stagnation of unemployment across Europe in particular. Now, the other sort of major limit is you don't have a financial sector, properly speaking, in these models. So banks essentially just pass money along. They're intermediaries, and there's no such thing as the possibility of the sort of financial crisis that we had in 2008, which is why every single central bank relying upon these DSGE models couldn't predict the financial crisis that was about to happen. So there's no sort of problem of systemic risk, no sort of possibility of a financial crisis like we saw. Now, obviously, with 2008, people have realized the limits of these, and they started to try to move away from them. So if we look at the Bank of England, for instance, in 2010, it spent £3.5 million on reviewing and building a new forecasting model. So they've been investing a fair amount of money trying to think about, well, how can we build a different economic model that predicts these things in an interesting and useful sort of way. Now you have a sort of turn towards complexity models. So in a DSGE model, you've got 3 agents. In a complexity model, each one of us would be modeled individually. So it wouldn't just be a household, it would be multiple households, which can help explain things like herding behavior. So you can't model herding behavior in a stock market with a single agent. There's no possibility of herding with one agent. But complexity models are quite good at this sort of stuff. So people are trying to build up that level. And you also have sort of attempts to incorporate the financial sector as well. So obviously, massive focus of research, trying to bring the financial sector and financial instability into these models as well. And one sort of interesting fact that I found in the research is that when you look at private firms, so an investment bank, for instance, and you look at the models that they use to make sense of the economy, they don't use DSGE models. They never have. They basically thought the DSGE models were completely useless if you're actually trying to make money off the economy. Instead, I want to do a lot more research on this, but anecdotal data that I've seen so far suggests that actually they use a lot of heterodox modeling. So Minsky and Kalecki and all these sorts of heterodox economists, which I think is really quite interesting. A sort of critical approach to economics is actually what an investment bank uses when they want to think about the economy. Okay, so I got 5 minutes. I'm going to skip through some of the stuff fairly quickly. Now, one thing I want to sort of mention is how models sort of work. When we think about models in general, and I want to borrow here from Mary Morgan's work. what models do. So models impose two sets of rules. There's rules imposed by the material of the model. So we can build the same model in terms of just mathematical formalism, computational means, hydraulic means, or visual means. The material of the model determines what we can do, how we can manipulate it. So what we can do with that sort of ammoniac hydraulic example with water is completely different from what we can do with a computational-based media. The other sort of rule imposed is by the subject matter of the model. So is it about economics? Is it about politics? Is it a natural system that we're talking about? Now, the interesting sort of thing here is that these two rules bring together, essentially, once you build in all the assumptions, they allow a chain of inferences to be brought out very, very quickly. And this is what computers are so good at, is once you put a model into a computer, you can follow that chain of inferences indefinitely, and it allows you to start thinking about, well, what is the economy going to look like in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? But now models are part of a larger sort of cognitive assemblages. So the stuff that Michael Wheeler was talking about, a sort of extended cognitive system, they're also part of this. And I think this is quite interesting when we talk about central bank modeling. I have focused just on the model so far, but actually when you go and talk with policymakers and monetary people doing monetary policy, you realize that models are used as part of a distributed cognitive reasoning system, a socio-technical reasoning system. So models will be the basis of certain assumptions. They'll sit and debate these sorts of things. They'll then feed in new assumptions to models, rerun the models, and they become part of a larger sort of reasoning process that isn't just contained within the model, even if the model is contributing to it. So this is, I think, a quite interesting example of the extended mind theory in practice. Okay, now I want to sort of end here with thinking about sort of post-capitalist and sort of democratic and people's potentials for modeling. Three sorts of areas that I want to talk about. The first one is sort of democratic modeling. So the idea being that central banks today are the sort of elite institution par excellence. The independence of central banks means that we don't really have much say over what they do and don't do. So this is, sort of a massive problem if you think that elite technocratic institutions are a problem. Some of us don't think that, but yeah, so the question of democratic modeling, how can we bring in a wider set of voices into economic policymaking? And this is particularly when we think about these things, again, as a socio-technical reasoning process, rather than just a model, we start to take into account, well, different voices do matter within that reasoning process. So how can we start thinking about a democratic version of economic policymaking? The Cybersyn is a great example, early 1970s in Chile, where the idea was to have a sort of decentralized planning of the economy. Workers on factory floor would have a say over how the economy was run, what they would be producing in factories, how quickly they'd be producing it, all of this sort of stuff. So it's an interesting example to think about how do we incorporate everyday people's voices into the planning of the economy. The other sort of aspect I want to think about is material modeling. So one of the issues that we have today is that capitalism obviously doesn't care about the climate, about nature. It only cares insofar as it's valued in monetary terms. But now what if we start thinking about modeling in terms of material terms rather than monetary terms? And this is what the Soviet Union had to do. Trying to use a sort of non-monetary based system, they had to guide the economy in terms of physical units of material. So this is sort of another interesting example of how we might be able to incorporate environmental concerns into our economic modeling in a way which is much more palatable to the environment. And finally, my sort of point being that if economic models are a major way in which we have gained new levers of power over the economy, how could we imagine models that create levers of power that benefit the people rather than the rich? So if monetarist models gave us a sort of way in which to control the monetary supply in order to hurt workers, how could we think of different models that would enable us to have more power? And I'll sort of leave off with that question. Thank you.